Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to my salon. This is Mental Floss Video. And did you know that Rumi is the best-selling poet in the United States? That's right, the Persian poet who was born in 1207 CE still sells millions of copies of his work. So if you're not reading Rumi, you should be. Anyway, that's the first of many facts about poets I'm going to share with you today. Before Emily Dickinson died at the age of 55, she'd already planned out some really particular details for her funeral, like she knew she wanted a predominantly white color scheme, and she also had a preferred route to the cemetery. Speaking of poet color preference, Pablo Neruda wrote most of his works in green ink. It was a color he found hopeful. The FBI had a file on Langston Hughes, partly because of his poem Goodbye Christ, written in 1932. The poem was considered both atheist and communist, which was enough to get the FBI's attention. Thomas Wyatt was rumored to have an affair with Anne Boleyn. Some believe that his poem Whoso Lists to Hunt is about their relationship. It's thought that William Shakespeare accessorized with a single gold hoop earring. That was a trend at the time, and we see the earring in the famous Chandos portrait, named after its former owner, the Dukes of Chandos. And speaking of Shakespeare, Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that aliens would probably call this planet not Earth, but Shakespeare, which is a beautiful, if somewhat Anglo-centric notion. But of course, poets don't always love each other's work. For instance, John Keats hated Lord Byron. In 1819, Keats wrote a letter to his brother in which he said, "You speak of Lord Byron and me. There is this great difference between us. He describes what he sees, I describe what I imagine. Mine is the hardest task." And to be fair to Keats, he was right. But Lord Byron could be cool. For instance, he got the poet Leigh Hunt to give Mary Shelley's dead husband's heart back to its rightful owner. Basically, Hunt took the heart, which actually may have been a liver, but whatever, from the cremation site and wouldn't give it to Mary Shelley, but eventually Lord Byron made him. Another feud, Mark Twain challenged a newspaper rival to a duel in 1864. According to his autobiography, Twain's practice shots literally couldn't hit a barn door, but his second shot the head off a sparrow right as some spies came up to see how good Twain was. And after a few lies about how Twain routinely hit shots like that, his challenger backed down. As Nevada was bringing in strict dueling laws, though, Twain ended up moving to San Francisco. For the record, like a lot of stories Mark Twain told about his life, that one probably wasn't true, but he was a poet. You should check out The War Prayer. It's a good one. Another great American writer, Maya Angelou. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, received a Presidential Medal of Honor, and won 3 Grammys. She also had a cameo in the film Medea's Family Reunion, and once made Tupac cry, and apparently called him Six Pack. Link in the video description below, by the way, to her telling that story, because I won't do it justice. Robert Burns often gets credit for the phrase "a gentleman and a scholar." We're not positive that he coined it, but its first known use in print is from his 1786 poem, The Twa Dogs. And John Donne gave us 2 popular phrases in one poem, which was technically originally prose: "No man is an island, and for whom the bell tolls." The passage is known as Meditation 17. Charles Bukowski once said in an interview, "I don't think I have written a poem when I was completely sober." Because we don't know anything about Homer, the citizens of at least 7 cities claim he was born there. William Blake is one of the most famous British poets, but he actually earned money throughout his life doing another art form, engravings. And then there's T.S. Eliot, who loved cats and writing about them. In 1964, he had dinner with a man named Anthony Loud, and Eliot wrote a thank you note in which he claimed that the meal was so wonderful it inspired him to invent a new character, Cumberly Loud, after his host's cat. There was a whole poem about the cat in the note. But moving on from Anthony Loud to William Lauder, John Milton was once accused of plagiarism by Lauder, who wrote multiple essays in the mid-18th century in which he quoted poems from about a century earlier that Milton appeared to have copied. But in reality, Lauder had inserted bits of Paradise Lost into other poems because he was bitter about his own career. Another famous poet accused of plagiarism, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was accused by Edgar Allan Poe, who claimed that Longfellow stole the ideas of other artists, but not actually the words, which was considered a perfectly acceptable poetic technique at the time, and also kind of still is. Edgar Allan Poe, by the way, was very popular with children, some of whom would follow him around town pretending to be ravens. It became this ongoing joke. They'd caw at him until he'd turn around and shout, "Nevermore!" and then they'd run away. Another poet who had a lot of fans in his day was William Wordsworth. In a description of their house, his wife Mary wrote, "At this moment, a group of young tourists are standing before the window." Slightly off topic, but don't visit writers in their home uninvited. Or more generally, don't visit people in their homes uninvited. Walt Whitman had brothers with some interesting names: Andrew Jackson Whitman, George Washington Whitman, Thomas Jefferson Whitman, and also Edward and Jesse. Those Whitmans had so many boys they just ran out of presidents. The famous ancient Chinese poet Li Po was known for his love of wine. Although he probably died under fairly normal circumstances, a rumor spread that he died because he was drunk on a boat at night and tried to grab the moon's reflection in the water. John Clare once ran away from an asylum and walked 80 miles over the course of 3.5 days trying to get home. Lewis Carroll loved looking at things through his microscope. He had an 1859 Smith & Beck model, the most advanced one on shelves at the time. He once wrote about looking at amoebas and larvae, explaining, "The creatures are most conveniently transparent, and you see all kinds of organs jumping about like a complicated piece of machinery." The Robert Frost poem War Thoughts at Home was finally published in 2006, about 88 years after it was written. It turned up in a collection of Frost correspondences donated to the University of Virginia by one of his friends. Frost had actually inscribed the poem in a copy of his book North of Boston. In 1935, E.E. Cummings had a book of poems published titled No Thanks. The dedication read, "No thanks to," and then was a list of the 14 publishers who had rejected him. Shel Silverstein was super picky about how his books were published, like he hated paperback books. He also had a say in the book's shape, size, color, and even paper feel. Christina Rossetti was so conservative that she allegedly censored poetry written by other people in her personal collection by pasting paper over passages that she considered blasphemous. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, under the pen names Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, collaborated on a book of poems, which was published in the mid-1840s. Only 2 copies were sold. Also, Charlotte Bronte popularized the name Shirley as a woman's name, although not from her poems, from her novel Shirley. And while we're on the topic of the Brontes, Emily Bronte once wrote an essay in defense of cats, claiming they're self-reliant and human-like. Another group of 19th century siblings who wrote poems together were the Tennyson brothers, the best known being Alfred. In 1827, he published a book of poems with his brothers, Frederick and Charles, although it was weirdly called Poems by Two Brothers. Like the Bronte book, it also wasn't a commercial success. Alfred started gaining recognition a couple years later when he published the poem Mariana. Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her husband Robert once exchanged 600 letters over a 20-month period. And speaking of Robert Browning, he wasn't too fond of his now most famous poem, The Pied Piper of Hamelin. It's believed that he only put it in his dramatic lyrics pamphlet because he needed to fill space in the 16 pages. And while we're on the subject of poets and their spouses, Sylvia Plath married her husband Ted Hughes on June 16, 1956. They chose that date because it's Bloomsday, the date in James Joyce's Ulysses. W.B. Yeats helped found the Irish National Theatre Society in 1903, along with a few other poets. Soon it morphed into the Abbey Theatre Company and became the National Theatre of Ireland. One of Lucille Clifton's favorite responses to people who asked how she found time to write poetry while raising 6 kids was, "Why do you think my poems are so short?" And finally, I returned to my salon to tell you that Dr. Seuss had a vanity license plate. It said Grinch. Thanks for watching Mental Floss video, which is made with the help of all of these nice people. Let me know in comments what your favorite poem is. I'm looking for new reading, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.